Very happy to be here. As you can see, my talk is titled W.B. Yeats's India, Revisiting Yeats's Engagements with Interlocutors from the Subcontinent. I call it the subcontinent, of course, because this is pre-independence and pre-partition India. As early as the 1880s, European avant-garde circles had been interested in India, and Indians had been part of the European cultural and political fabric. We also know that William Butler Yeats never visited India, yet he met several Indians through his life, learned about India through them and his readings, and India frequently features in his own writings. Yeats himself wrote later in his life that the little I know of India has come to me in the main by word of mouth. The most prominent of the Indians he encountered, in order of his meeting them, are Mohini Chatterjee, Rabindranath Tagore, and Shri Purohit Swami. I'd like to chart his interactions with these men, how they come to impact his writings, and what it reveals to us about the India in Yeats's mind. I'd like to suggest that this India, the one in Yeats's mind, is one which is a land of ancient history and continuity, but in reading his works today, also is a place very much constructed and celebrated imaginatively in the service of Yeats's own spiritual system and his engagements with the idea of a national poet figure. The Indian I'll feature most prominently is Rabindranath Tagore, of course, since that was the most popularly known and fruitful engagement across the Indo-Irish literary channels. It was in 1886 that Yeats met Mohini Chatterjee, who was then Theosophy's roving ambassador in Europe and had been engaged in the activities of the Dublin Hermetic Society. He was a Bengali lawyer and scholar from a prominent background who had joined the Theosophical Society and arrived in Europe in 1884, accompanying Madame Blavatsky and H.S. Olcott. The young Yeats was taken by his first encounter with this Eastern holy man, especially at a time in his life when he was exploring spirituality. Preaching on Vedanta, Chatterjee, with his long beard, brown skin, dark eyes, and spiritual utterances, certainly made an impact. Yeats's biographer, Roy Foster, notes that by this time, Yeats had also likely read Kalidasa's play Shakuntala, and Chatterjee was, in Foster's words, preaching the mystical existential principles of Shankara, which involved the extinguishing of action in order to express that which is universal in the individual self, the soul being emanations from four divine spirits, endlessly incarnated and endlessly returning to their source. He preached of the external world and action as illusion or maya, and the value of renunciation and withdrawal from worldly matters, in the vein of Shankaracharya and the Advaita Vedanta, which dealt with non-duality through the study of the Upanishadic texts. Foster pinpoints that Yeats was not yet exposed to the French symbolists, Blake, Pater, or Berkeley, and in 1886, Theosophy could not have been presented more attractively, although some of the other doctrines, such as the abjuration of worldly ambition, were probably not so appealing. Chatterjee would eventually return to India following scandals about affairs with disciples, but his initial impact on Yeats is undeniable. The influence of Yeats's interaction with Chatterjee is evident in early collections like Crossways, in poems like Anasuya and Vijaya and The Indian Upon God. But even as late as 1933, when after his Nobel Prize win and amid deteriorating health, Yeats published a collection like The Winding Stair and other poems, he includes a poem named Mohini Chatterjee. Now, this is a revealing text for Yeats's engagement with Indian spirituality and his manner of molding it for his own spiritual purposes. He first wrote this poem upon meeting Chatterjee, but Warwick Gould notes that he rewrote it in 1927, framed as a dialogue between a young spiritual apprentice and the Brahmin. The first of the two stanzas sets out Chatterjee's belief in the doctrine of reincarnation and puts Chatterjee's own words in verse form. Pray for nothing. Say every night in bed, I have been a king, I have been a slave, nor is there anything, fool, rascal, knave, that I have not been. And yet upon my breast a myriad heads have lain. But it's the second stanza that looks back at this particular interaction. This is a more mature speaker acknowledging that Chatterjee had provided a discursive place of comfort upon his breast to a young boy at a spiritually turbulent time of his life. But there are two other interesting things happening here, I think. The first is that Yeats seems to recognize his own long-standing habit of paraphrasing the words of other speakers and writers. He spoke these or words like these. That inexactitude, I think, is likely due both to Yeats's habits of paraphrasing, but also thanks to the passage of time. Secondly, in the line, I add in commentary, we get Yeats taking the teachings of Chatterjee and interpreting them in his own way for his own purposes, which seem to do away with that emphasis on renunciation, like Foster accurately pinpoints. And I think these two lines are revelatory about Yeats's own approach to Indian spirituality. Conversely to Chatterjee, Yeats places rather an emphasis on the senses, for men dance on deathless feet. Additionally, of the meeting of birth hour and death hour, Ashim Datta has posited two possible readings, which can indicate either, and I quote here, an arrest of the cycle of reincarnation, and hence an uninterrupted spiritual existence, or the dynamic continuity of the cycle of reincarnation. Datta recognizes that the dynamism of this poem must have been owing in part to the dialectical energy of Yeats's own mystic philosophic system, a vision. Between these two stanzas of Mohini Chatterjee lie the many years Yeats had to reflect on his influence. And there seems to be that self-conscious move away from the kind of Vedantic mysticism of Indian origins and into a reorganizing of its components into his own esoteric thinking. Now, Yeats was not proficient enough to distinguish between the finer points of his spirituality as it was preached, as admittedly neither am I. But whereas the role he had adopted in relation to Chatterjee was first that of disciple in some sense and commentator, he took on a more active role as editor and translator with Tagore and Purohit Swami. What seems to be common to these three Indians is the impression that they had on him as exotic, holy men carrying the wisdom of the East. For instance, he writes of Chatterjee as a Brahmin philosopher, a handsome young man with the typical face of Christ. And of their meeting, he writes, my first meeting with the philosophy that confirmed my vague speculations and seemed at once logical and boundless. In An Indian Monk, he describes Shri Purohit Swami as a man of 50, broken in health by the austerities of his religious life. He must have been a stalwart man, and he is still handsome. And he writes that the Swami evoked in his mind the image of some Catholic theologian who has lived in the best society. He writes that Purohit Swami is something much simpler, more childlike and ancient. In the essay, Swami is my Indian monk. Whereas in the introduction to Gitanjali, Tagore's first collection of poems translated into the English, Yeats recalls hearing about the author from My Indians and describes him in very similar terms. And I think it's worth considering this relationship in some detail, for it is a multifaceted one. Yeats first met Rabindranath Tagore in July of 1912 through William Rothenstein, who had founded the India Society 2 years earlier, and visited Calcutta, met the Tagore family. In 1912, Tagore had been introduced to the likes of Ezra Pound, Thomas Sturge Moore, May Sinclair, and others. Infatuated with Tagore, Yeats gave a reading at the gathering on the 7th of July, one that Sturge Moore would privately describe to his wife as abominable. He was quickly hailed as the next big thing, with both Sinclair and Pound writing him up in magazines like North American Review and Fortnightly. Pound even included some of his poems in the magazine Poetry. But there is an exoticizing and orientalizing vein running through their descriptions of Tagore. Sturge Moore, for example, depicts him as being on view, a sweet creature beautiful to the eye in a silk turban. More of this we find in Yeats's introduction to Tagore's Gitanjali, and it's a text that I'll be quoting from at length. Through the figure described in Yeats's introduction, we see his sense of India as a place of enduring traditions, of continuity, ancient spiritualism, and Tagore becomes representative of that. He likens Tagore to the Indian civilization itself. Tagore was by this time a well-established figure in the Indian cultural landscape. It is no surprise that Yeats recalls first hearing about him from others, particularly a Bengali doctor of medicine, who considered Tagore the best of the Indian poets, calling it the epoch of Rabindranath. He informs Yeats about Tagore's illustrious family background and his immense popularity in India. And Yeats exuberantly declares of him an innocence, a simplicity that one does not find elsewhere in literature. At times, I wonder if he has it from the literature of Bengal or from religion. And at other times, I find pleasure in thinking it hereditary, a mystery that was growing through the centuries. Indeed, when he is speaking of children, so much a part of himself this quality seems, one is not certain that he is not also speaking of the saints. Here again is the parallel drawn to the saints, the reference to childlike innocence, all via a lineage passed down through the ages. The critic Anna Jelnikar points that Tagore may be positively valorized, but he is fundamentally perceived as the other. Identifying spirituality, spontaneity, and Tagore's contemplative persona as essentially Eastern, Jelnikar claims that, and I quote, Yeats both draws from and feeds into these broad stereotypes, reproducing in his portrayal of Tagore not only the cliched opposition of the spiritual East to the materialist West, but an entire array of similar dichotomies. But it isn't just an orientalized image of Tagore, but of Bengal as a pastoral, almost pre-industrial land of spirituality. An East which, in Yeats's words, knows how to keep a family illustrious, and through its cradles produces these lyrics, full of subtlety of rhythm, of untranslatable delicacies of color, of metrical invention. The work of a supreme culture, they yet appear as much the growth of the common soil as the grass and the rushes. He writes of it as a tradition where poetry and religion are the same thing, has passed through the centuries, gathering from learned and unlearned metaphor and emotion, and carried back again to the multitude the thought of the scholar and the noble. And I think this is what Tagore lends to Yeats that Chatterjee and Purohit Swami perhaps didn't. With Tagore, he has a poetic kinship. He may imagine the figure of the poet as this aristocratic noble figure, an arbitrator of both knowledge and taste, drawing the image of Tagore into what he knows of the Romantic poets and other influences. We can see echoes here of Shelley's declaration, for instance, that the poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Similarly, in his lecture, The Poet Yeats, written by Tagore in 1912, soon after meeting Yeats, he writes that, and I quote here, "In its efforts to express its distinctive spirit, Ireland turned to its own language, legends, and mythical tales, thus providing one or two persons of extraordinary powers with the scope to exercise their genius. The poet Yeats is one of them. He has won victory for the message of Ireland in world literature." Despite the fact that Yeats wrote in English, Tagore too valorizes him as representing Ireland to the world, much as he seemed to be doing for India at the time. The association of one poet with the very fabric of his culture is one we also see in Yeats's Nobel Prize citation, awarding him for his always inspired poetry, which, in a highly artistic form, gives expression to the spirit of a whole nation. But Yeats also makes certain oversimplifications here. The culture of Bengal is not a homogeneous one, and Tagore himself combines various cultural influences in his work, from the Romantic to the Bengali Vaishnav and Baul traditions. Additionally, Bengal also had a rich political tradition of nationalist resistance to the British Raj. And Yeats does seem to have some awareness of this, even if it goes unmentioned in this particular piece. For instance, writing to Edmund Gosse in November 1912, he asks Gosse to read Tagore's poems sent to him via the India Society, and declares that it would be an imaginative and notable thing for us to elect him to our academic committee. He is the great poet of Bengal, though eligible for election because of his English translation of his work alone. I think from the English point of view too, it would be a fine thing to do, a piece of wise imperialism, for he is worshipped as no poet of Europe is. I believe that if we pay him honor, it will be understood that we honor India also, for he is its most famous man today. There is here both that binary division of India as other, but also a sense of what the optics would have been from an English point of view. Rather an uncomfortable position to take for an Irish author who had by this point written his most nationalist play. However, I am of the opinion that this was something of a deliberate maneuver on Yeats's part. He was no doubt aware of the popularity that such an orientalizing framing of Tagore would generate in the West. And he was right. The committee, when awarding Tagore the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1913, Tagore was incidentally the first non-European winner of this prize, and he was nominated by Sturge Moore. The citation of this Nobel Prize speaks predominantly of Tagore's poetry. In 1915, he was knighted. Between the first printing of Gitanjali by the India Society in March 1913 and the Nobel Prize win on November 13th of that very year, Gitanjali was reprinted 10 times. The publishers Macmillan, taking over the publication, ran 20 reprints over 2 years. Yeats's spearheading of Tagore's publicity machine was in part responsible for this. But Tagore himself was aware of the way in which he was being presented on an English stage and bears some complicity in the process. In letters to Sturge Moore and Rothenstein as early as 1914, he would express agitation over rumors in India that Yeats had a bigger hand in the translations of Gitanjali than he did. He continued working with Yeats for a while afterwards, nonetheless, though he spoke sparingly about Yeats's works. However, he was complimentary about Kathleen Ni Houlihan. But interestingly, the only time Tagore sent in a nomination to the Nobel Committee was in 1935 for James Cousins. Yeats, for his part, would express dissatisfaction with later translations of Tagore's poetry, which were taken up by several translators, both Indian and Western, besides the author, and published too rapidly, hoping to capitalize on Tagore's Western fame. In the 1916 to 17 period, Yeats commented on the vagueness of some of these collections, thanks to Tagore's grasp of English, calling the collection Lover's Gift rather an embarrassment, and wrote in a 1935 letter to Rothenstein, "Damn Tagore, we got our 3 good books, Sturge Moore and I, and then because he thought it more important to see and know English than to be a great poet, he bought out sentimental rubbish and wrecked his reputation. Tagore does not know English. No Indian knows English. Nobody can write with the music and style in a language not learned in childhood, and ever since the language of his thought." I shall return to the question of Tagore, but not yet. I shall return to it because he has published in recent years, and in English, prose books of great beauty. And these books have been ignored because of the eclipse of his reputation as a poet. He is speaking, of course, of the West, because in India these books were received rather well. And the prose texts to which he refers are the nationalist novel The Home in the World and his autobiography Reminiscences. It's also worth considering what encountering Tagore and imagining India through the lens of his writings meant for Yeats. His relationship to Tagore was in some sense mutually beneficial, though not to the same degree. Yeats' introduction to Gitanjali is now nearly as famous as the poetry that it precedes. Upon reading his introduction, the poet Marian Moore published a small poem in the Egoist in May 1915. It's titled To William Butler Yeats on Tagore. It is made clear by the phrase, even the mood, by virtue of which he says the thing he thinks, that it pays to cut gems even in these conscienceless days. But the jewel that always outshines ordinary jewels is your praise. This small poem, I think, demonstrates to us the impact, not just of Tagore's writing, but of their collaborative cutting of gems. But finally, it pinpoints the impact of Yeats's own introduction. And it is to Yeats and his work that Marian Moore returns over the years. For his part, Tagore would also dedicate his 1913 collection of poetry, The Gardener, to Yeats. From an editorial perspective, Yeats imagines himself as the first public reader of Tagore's works. He declares that, "I have carried the manuscript of these translations about with me for days, reading it in railway trains or on the top of omnibuses and in restaurants, and I have often had to close it lest some stranger would see how much it moved me." And indeed, he was moved by them. Tagore's works felt both strange and familiar to Yeats. He writes that a whole people, a whole civilization immeasurably strange to us, seems to have been taken up into this imagination. And yet we are not moved because of its strangeness, but because we have met our own image, as though we had walked in Rossetti's willow wood, or heard perhaps for the first time in literature, our voice as in a dream. Unlike Mohini Chatterjee, Tagore combined the spiritual with the sensual. And what Yeats found in these poems spoke not just to his idea of the poet figure, but of the affinities between India and Ireland. To Yeats, this ancient culture of India, as he saw it, had close connections to the Celtic traditions. And he admitted to Rothenstein that Tagore pointed a moral that would be valuable to me in Ireland. Joseph Lennon argues that, and I quote here, "For Yeats, Tagore's voice spoke not only of Bengal, India, or the Orient, but also of an ideal culture, one in which an intermediary or supplementary place existed for the Anglo-Irish." We can see Yeats being taken here with the long-standing heritage and aristocracy of the Tagore household, the passing down of creativity through its generations. Indeed, several of the Tagore family members were public figures. And I think this is significant at a time when Yeats, as an author, is writing the poems of responsibilities, which are very much concerned with the idea of a pared down, unembellished spiritual sensibility as well as legacy. And as the epigraph to the collection goes, India, I think, becomes one of those dreams wherein begin responsibility. This collection opens with his preoccupation with the poet's legacy. "Although I have come close on 49, I have no child, I have nothing but a book, nothing but that to prove your blood and mine." There remain for Yeats questions, not just of his personal, familial, and creative legacy, but questions of how one can imagine the figure of the Irish poet, as he had imagined the Indian poet, for example. How can an artist represent the national culture from which he emerges and into which he feeds his literature? But there is in this collection, Responsibilities, a melancholy that one also finds in some of Tagore's works. By the time they met, Tagore had lost a wife, a son, a daughter, and his father. But Yeats's poem, A Coat, one of the final poems of Responsibilities, also speaks to a certain unadorned sensibility of a move back into ancient time and myth that then allows the poet to find new creative direction. "I made my song a coat, covered with embroideries out of old mythologies." And he ends, "Song, let them take it, for there's more enterprise in walking naked." Several of Tagore's poems also repeatedly invoke the challenges of embellishment and adornment. What we see here is that Yeats, for a time, steps back from that austere spirituality of Chatterjee and finds a fellow poet who both embraces the sensuality that Yeats himself was preoccupied with and can also serve as a stand-in for this imagined land, one that to Yeats retains everything wise and ancient, unhampered by colonialism and modernity. But it's also clear that this is an imagined place, for India was very much impacted by both colonialism and modernity in its own complex ways. But such a way of framing his understanding of India, I think, was useful for the creative process of the author. Meanwhile, while Gitanjali was first published by the India Society and then Macmillan, Tagore's play, The Post Office, translated by Devrata Mukherjee, was published first by Kola Press and then by Macmillan in 1914. This text also has a preface by Yeats. And I think It's telling that Yeats made the choice to publish it first in Ireland instead of via the India Society, as he had done to Gitanjali. Barry Shields notes that Yeats gave the play its first English language production in Dublin for the benefit of the masters and boys of the Irish language school of St. Edna's. It was then staged by Yeats and Lady Gregory in the Abbey Theatre on the 17th of May 1913, alongside Patrick Pearse's Henri, which I know as the King, and later in London. In part, Pearse had requested Yeats's assistance with the fundraising for his school after learning that Yeats had called Tagore's school, Shantiniketan, the Indian St. Edna's. Tagore subsequently decided to stage Henri at Shantiniketan and wrote that he was delighted with it. What we see here is a larger understanding of India's political kinship with Ireland, as nations struggling for independence and self-determination from British powers. While Tagore's international fame was formed via Gitanjali and the Eastern sage image, there was another strand of curatorship being played out on the Indo-Irish stage, one very much separate from that English piece of wise imperialism. In this instance, there appears what Leela Gandhi calls affective communities, built on transnational solidarities and the politics of friendship between those that existed on the margins, in the spaces between binary divisions. And in this, I think, Yeats is one of the earliest to recognize the affinities between Tagore's play and Pearse's, and to see that Tagore's English popularity was in some ways separate from his popularity in other parts of the world, particularly in nations similarly struggling for self-determination. The tides of Tagore's fame in England would ebb with the coming of World War I, with the publication of his lectures on nationalism, the returning of his knighthood, protesting against the Amritsar massacre of 1919. But his popularity on the European continent would endure, and Tagore did several lecture tours in the 1920s and 30s as well. Meanwhile, Tagore and Yeats grew apart, though they continued to correspond sporadically. Yet Yeats continued to reference this idea of India in his writing, alongside other Eastern cultures, esoteric practices, and old legends from which he drew inspiration. Here, for instance, is one reference from Per Amica Silentia Lunae. I have always sought to bring my mind close to the mind of the Indian and Japanese poets. Old women in Kannauj, mediums in Soho, lay brothers whom I imagine dreaming in some medieval monastery the dreams of their village, learned authors who refer all to antiquity. To immerse it in the general mind, where the mind is scarce separable from what we have begun to call the subconscious. Here is India again, represented through its poets, placed alongside other antiquarian points of influence, all feeding into that great storehouse of images and symbols for Yeats to draw from. But it was only in 1931, amid the cultural nationalism of his later years, that India would come back to the forefront of Yeats's engagements upon his meeting with this man, Shri Purohit Swami. Yeats met Purohit Swami via Sturge Moore, and the Swami brought prominent focus on Indian spirituality back to Yeats at a time when he was dealing with his own aging and ailments and questions of mortality. And at this time, it does seem to provide him preoccupation as a translator and editor, if not spiritual comfort. Yet the relationship also had its more transactional aspects. Sturge Moore too had an editorial hand in the monk's autobiography, but later fell out with him over monetary issues. For his part, Purohit Swami was aware of what had been to the public eye a hugely fruitful partnership between Yeats and Tagore. Foster even records that the Swami, and I quote here, realizing that Yeats could help him more than Sturge Moore, tried to pay off the latter with £10 and associate his autobiography with the man who had made Tagore's name in the West. And yet, despite warnings from Sturge Moore, Yeats continued to work with him, finding in his works exciting tales of disciplehood and travels to the sacred mountains, asceticism, spiritual transcendence, and a better study of the Upanishads than he had found with his earlier interlocutors. Whereas Chatterjee and Tagore were both Bengali, Shri Purohit Swami was Maharashtrian or Marathi, two regions of India nearly 2,000 kilometers apart. So taken was he with Purohit Swami that he helped publish his autobiography, An Indian Monk, as well as the biography of Purohit Swami's spiritual guru, Bhagwan Sri Hamsa, titled The Holy Mountain, and Patanjali's Aphorisms of Yoga. For all these texts, Yeats provided introductions, as he had done with Gitanjali. They also worked together on the translations published as the 10 principal Upanishads. In a general introduction to my work, Yeats recalls, being a man, I denounced the oppression of the people of India. Being a man of letters, not a politician, I told how they had been forced to learn everything, even their own Sanskrit, to the vehicle of English, till the first discoverers of wisdom had become bywords for vague, abstract facility. I begged the Indian writers present to remember that no man can think or write with music and vigor, except in his mother tongue. I turned a friendly audience hostile, yet when I think of that scene, I am unrepentant and angry. I could no more have written in Gaelic than those Indians write in English. Gaelic is my national language, but it is not my mother tongue. In Ireland After Parnell, he writes, "It is so in India, where peasants sing the words of the great poet of Bengal without knowing whose words they sing." I think he refers here to Tagore because Tagore's poetry was set to music, and there's a school of music called Rabindra Sangeet. I continue here, and it must often be so, where the old imaginative folk life is undisturbed. And it is so among schoolboys who hand their storybooks to one another without looking at the title page to read the author's name. Here and there, however, the peasants had not lost the habit of Gaelic criticism, picked up perhaps from the poets who took refuge among them after the ruin of the great Catholic families. Yeats here recognizes the particular challenge when older knowledge structures must be accessed through the vehicle of English, and the impact of colonialism on ancient cultures, even ones that he erroneously thinks of as homogeneous. And we also get the sense of the poet being subsumed into the folk knowledge of these cultures. As an English language Irish author, he simultaneously confirms his own need to write in English. For as he had exclaimed in his earlier letter to Rothenstein that we saw, nobody can write with music and style in a language not learned in childhood, and ever since the language of his thought. According to Shirshendu Mazumdar, and I quote here, to Yeats, the Sanskrit texts not only carried philosophical value, the language itself was symbolic of India's rich cultural heritage. Just as he believed that ancient Irish myths and folklore constituted the Irish tradition, ancient Sanskrit literature, similarly, constituted for him the actual Indian tradition. Yeats, however, does not take into account the fact that Sanskrit, the language, and the literature written in it, denotes the high culture and is distinguished from a wide variety of Indian folk traditions. Incidentally, the 10 principal Upanishads is a text that the current Indian Prime Minister gifted the American President Joe Biden upon his recent visit to India, knowing very well his affinity for both Irish literature and Yeats particularly. In the Oxford Book of Modern Verse as well, Yeats included 7 poems by Tagore, all translated by the author from the original Bengali, and 3 poems by Shri Purohit Swami, translated from his own Hindi and Urdu. In his introduction to Gitanjali and the introductions to several of the Swami's texts, Yeats tells and retells stories and narratives told to him by others. And he quotes extensively from the works of the authors that he introduces. It is, I think, in some respects, an anthologizing of the oral narratives that he is given by these Indians, of their writings, of their spiritual journeys. In his introduction to The Holy Mountain, for instance, he is full of praise for Purohit Swami's devotion to his master. He imagines the meditative state of the Indian ascetic, as comprised of 4 stages corresponding to the chanting of the word Om: waking, dreaming, dreamless sleep, and a final stage of boundless and aimless consciousness and bliss, which is the manifestation of true personality, in Yeats's words. The significance of Om as a threefold vessel of time, soul, and consciousness is not lost on Yeats, and is recounted in 2 of the introductions. Neil Mann recognizes that Yeats seems to have found the Upanishads a particular help in his own esoteric work, A Vision, not least because of the link that they make between sleep and the afterlife. He draws on Vedic thought about the nature of different states of consciousness, and introducing the section, The Soul in Judgment, refers to certain Upanishads, which propose 3 states of consciousness or soul. The system set out in these texts is too vast and complex for me to dismantle specifically Vedantic or more widely Indian influences. But whether it is the 28 reincarnations guided by the phases of the moon, or the long historical cycles, we can see patterns of thought that reflect Yeats's learnings through these Indian figures and their spiritual philosophies. In a 1934 poem like Meru, for instance, gives us a versification of the physical and the spiritual journey of the ascetic. We see here the idea of worldly illusion, a rough journeying towards the desolation of reality. And yet it does not result in the same manner of comfort or consolation that the Swami had perhaps hoped to convey through his texts. Here we can see Yeats bidding goodbye to Egypt, Greece, and Rome, those other ancient civilizations that he often places adjacently to India. But the Eastern spirituality is not named, perhaps because it is the setting within which the poem operates. Meru, after all, is one of the sacred mountains of Hindu and Buddhist belief, functioning as their symbolic center or spine. And Yeats also tends to see parallels between such spaces and the particular landscapes of Ireland. His earlier interests in the ideas of historical cycles and reincarnation still persists. The hermits, in search of spiritual transcendence, sit atop the Golden Mountain, but our speaker is the observer. He can tell us of the impact of the harsh climate, the night, the drifted snow, winter's dreadful blast on their naked bodies, can observe the passage of time, ravening through century after century. But the speaker is neither called upon to devote his body to austere practice, nor to give up a reliance on the senses. Until the last line, he can stand and observe and record for posterity that his glory and his monuments are gone. And in this lies the enduring link, I think, between the fellow poets that infatuate him. The Shelley who writes of Ozymandias, the Tagore who represents that Eastern mysticism wrapped in the figure of the sensual poet, and our speaker poet here, who near the end of his life stands upon the spiritual mountain, having taken to the speak a different journey than the ascetic monks. In conclusion, I think, from all these men, in different ways, he draws narratives and symbols and images that add to what would have been for Yeats the great storehouse of images and symbols from the East. These texts are also a means for him to translate this particular storehouse of Indian images into a Western form, to infuse them into his own spiritual thinking. Of course, this spiritual thinking also includes his reading of English Romantic poets, Irish folklore, French symbolists, theologians, philosophers like Nietzsche, and so on. Not only, finally, do we have Yeats theorizing about a place like India as one of uninterrupted history, ancient knowledge based in spirituality and religion, but we see him adopting portions of it, incorporating it into his own vast esoteric spiritual system based on cyclical patterns of change. I cannot say that what he maps out in A Vision is entirely of a philosophical or Vedantic or even Eastern bent. But his understanding of spiritual knowledge emanating from India certainly informs his later thought and his later works. Finally, through his work as an editor, we see emerging, editor, theatre producer, and translator as well. We see emerging an unacknowledged but modern India, not just with spiritual but political kinship to Ireland. And it is in recognizing both the ancient mystical India of his imagination and the modern India that sustained some of its historical traditions that I think we can truly understand Yeats's own attraction for it. And I'll stop there. Thank you.